Hello, and welcome to the World War Lab channel. Today, we're diving into a moment that forever changed how the world understood Japanese aviation during World War II, a discovery so shocking that it forced American analysts to rethink everything they believed about bomber design, combat philosophy, and the value placed on human life in aerial warfare. January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he raised his camera and photographed the aircraft standing before him, an intact Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber marked with the tail number 763-12. Something about it immediately felt wrong to him, deeply wrong. This could not be their standard design, he thought. No Air Force would ever build bombers this way. The fuselage glowed under the tropical sun, its smooth cylindrical body fully justifying the Allied nickname. Stretching nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, the bomber rested on its tricycle landing gear like a massive cigar lying on the tarmac. Its wings spanned about 25 meters from tip to tip and showed no sign of battle damage. The engines, 14-cylinder radial power plants producing roughly 1,500 horsepower each, appeared undamaged and fully intact. This was not a wreck salvaged from a crash site. This was a complete, operational bomber that had been abandoned by its crew during the American advance. But what captured McCoy's full attention, what would ultimately transform American understanding of Japanese aviation doctrine, was what he discovered when he climbed into the wings through the inspection panels. The fuel tanks had no protection at all. There was no self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coatings of any kind. Only a thin layer of aluminum, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separated thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. Major McCoy, commander of the Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, had examined dozens of wrecked Japanese aircraft across the theater. Yet nothing had prepared him for this. This bomber, abandoned intact during the American liberation of Clark Field, revealed a design philosophy so foreign to Western military thinking that analysts would need months to fully grasp its implications. The mathematics of this discovery would reshape American tactical doctrine and aircraft design for the remainder of the war. Every assumption American pilots held about enemy capabilities, about the sacrifices Japanese engineers were willing to make for performance, about how much the Imperial forces valued crew survival, was about to be systematically destroyed by the evidence contained in this single pristine aircraft, Japan's most important bomber. The path to this revelation had begun 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1941. That morning, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 82 G4M bombers and 26 G3M bombers lifted off from airfields on Formosa. Their target was Clark Field itself, the primary American air base in the Philippines. The attack achieved total tactical surprise. Arriving at 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet, well beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. 27 bombers from the first wave dropped 636 bombs across Clark Field's runways and facilities. Moments later, 0 fighters swept in at treetop level, their machine guns tearing through everything that had survived the bombing run. Of the 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed outright. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. In just 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines had been effectively wiped out. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving American pilots, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation withdrew northward. "What struck me," he later wrote in his combat report, "was how they came in. Perfect formation, high altitude, completely beyond our reach. Then the fighters dropped down and ripped us apart. We couldn't get a single plane airborne, and the Betty bombers themselves left untouched." The few American fighters that did manage to take off arrived too late, finding only empty sky. The Japanese had demonstrated the extraordinary range of their bombers, striking from bases 460 miles away, a feat no American bomber could match at that point in the war. The first year of combat for the Betty would prove devastatingly effective. On December 10, 1941, just 2 days after the attack on Clark Field, 26 G4M bombers joined older G3M Nell bombers in an assault on 4C, a British naval task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack began at approximately 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with a level of precision that stunned British observers. The Betty bombers carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms and fitted with a 205-kilogram warhead. These torpedoes were specifically designed for shallow water operations, running at depths that allowed them to strike ships even in coastal areas. The attacks focused on the two capital ships with devastating accuracy. Prince of Wales, a battleship displacing 43,000 tons and representing the newest generation of British naval power, took at least 6 torpedo hits, along with damage from level bombers. The underwater explosions tore massive holes in the hull, flooding compartments faster than damage control teams could respond. The ship began to list heavily. Repulse, a battlecruiser originally built during World War I and modernized in the 1930s, absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits while desperately maneuvering to evade the attackers. Her anti-aircraft fire managed to bring down several Japanese aircraft, but could not stop the relentless, coordinated torpedo runs. The accumulated damage proved fatal. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours. Prince of Wales went down at approximately 13:20. Repulse followed at around 13:33. 841 British sailors lost their lives. Survivors were rescued by escorting destroyers. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 hours from first contact to final sinking. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves in the open sea had been destroyed solely by air power. The G4M Betty bomber had accomplished what naval theorists had debated for decades. British naval supremacy in Asian waters had been shattered in just 90 minutes. Across the Pacific theater through early 1942, American and Allied pilots would encounter Betty bombers in every major engagement the aircraft seemed to operate with impunity, striking targets at distances that shattered every conventional expectation. They bombed Darwin, Australia, from bases nearly 1,500 miles away, demonstrating a reach that exceeded anything the Allies could match at the time. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields beyond the mountain ranges of New Guinea, maintaining constant pressure on Allied positions throughout the Southwest Pacific. They struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance of more than 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across enormous stretches of open ocean. The Betty's operational range gave Japanese forces a level of strategic flexibility that Allied commanders found almost impossible to counter. American fighters stationed at forward bases simply did not have the range to intercept Betty bombers taking off from distant airfields. Allied airfields were being attacked by aircraft launched from bases that were themselves beyond Allied striking distance. This asymmetry in bomber capability meant that Japanese forces could strike whenever and wherever they chose, while Allied forces struggled to respond in any meaningful way. This advantage persisted through the first 6 months of the war. Betty bombers took part in virtually every major Japanese offensive across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They attacked targets in the Philippines, Malaya, the Netherlands, East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They supported naval operations throughout the theater. They carried out reconnaissance missions at ranges no Allied aircraft could approach. The Betty became the living symbol of the reach and effectiveness of Japanese air power. But this advantage depended entirely on the absence of strong Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could strike without interception, when they could approach their targets at altitudes beyond anti-aircraft range, when they could deliver their weapons and withdraw before enemy fighters arrived, the aircraft was devastatingly effective. These conditions defined the first half of 1942, when Allied air strength was still limited and scattered. By mid-1942, however, the tactical situation began to change. American fighter strength increased. Wildcats gradually gave way to the more powerful Hellcats and Corsairs. Pilot training improved. Tactics evolved. and Betty crews began reporting alarming losses. The ship became impossible to ignore on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions on Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Tsavo Island. In the battle that followed, 18 of the 23 Betty bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 Japanese aviators were killed in what would become the single worst G4M loss of the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported the same observation after every engagement. The Betty burst into flames with minimal damage. 2 or 3 rounds striking almost anywhere along the fuselage or wings were enough to trigger catastrophic destruction. The aircraft quickly earned grim nicknames that spread through American squadrons. Flying Cigar, One Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo, all were references to the Betty's horrifying tendency to erupt into fire from even minor battle damage. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal commanding VF-17 and flying F-4U Corsairs, the Betty's reputation had completely reversed. The first time we caught a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easily they went down, Blackburn later recalled. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and they'd explode. We actively hunted them because we knew they were some of the most vulnerable targets in the Pacific sky. Yet the true depth of the Betty's vulnerability, the engineering decisions that made such catastrophic losses inevitable, would not be fully understood until American forces began capturing intact examples for detailed examination. The first major intelligence breakthrough came in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, technical air intelligence teams discovered several Betty bombers in various states of damage. Initial inspections confirmed exactly what pilots had been reporting in combat. The fuel tanks had absolutely no protection. Aeronautical engineers from the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific conducted the first detailed analysis. Accessing the wings through inspection panels, they found fuel cells with no defensive measures of any kind, thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealing layers, no protective coatings, no fire suppression systems. Multiple Betty bombers examined at Buna showed the same features. This was not battle damage. This was not field modification. This was standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. By 1942, American bombers universally used self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had incorporated them beginning with the B-17C model. The B-24 Liberator had featured them from the XB-24B prototype onward. Even fighter aircraft such as the P-38 and P-47 had protected fuel systems. Self-sealing tanks used layered rubber compounds that expanded when exposed to fuel. When punctured by bullets or shell fragments, the material swelled and sealed the hole, preventing fuel leaks and reducing the chance of fire. This technology added significant weight to an aircraft, but it dramatically increased crew survival. American doctrine viewed this weight penalty as essential and non-negotiable. And yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in the thousands and operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks that offered zero protection. The weight savings from eliminating self-sealing systems, armor plating, and fire suppression equipment were immediately obvious. But so was the price paid in crew lives, reflected in the mounting loss statistics after every engagement. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most complete technical evaluation of all. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system on the aircraft. Their report, classified secret and distributed throughout the Allied Air Forces, laid out the precise specifications that explained both the Betty's extraordinary performance and its catastrophic weaknesses. The G4M Model 1 specifications revealed an aircraft ruthlessly optimized for range and speed. An empty weight of just 6,741 kilograms, astonishingly light for a bomber of its size. A maximum takeoff weight of 9,500 kilograms. A fuel capacity of 4,780 liters was distributed across 8 completely unprotected tanks, 4 in each wing, positioned in the center section of the wings where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. The bomber had a top speed of 428 kilometers per hour, roughly 265 miles per hour. Its maximum range reached 6,340 kilometers, more than 3,700 miles. The service ceiling was 8,500 meters. The crew consisted of 7 men: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The design of the fuel system was especially revealing. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 pairs, positioned along the wing's longitudinal axis where the wings joined the fuselage. This location allowed engineers to use the thickest portion of the wing structure, maximizing fuel capacity, but also place the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire. Any attack from the side or from below would almost certainly strike the fuel tanks. The thin aluminum construction offered no protection whatsoever. Without self-sealing compounds, even the smallest puncture would cause continuous fuel leakage. American engineers later calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. That weight saving translated directly into more fuel and therefore greater range. But the cost of this vulnerability was just as measurable. Combat reports showed that Betty bombers hit anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. The unprotected fuel tanks created what engineers called a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed the loss of the entire aircraft. These figures told the story of design decisions made as early as September 1937, when the Japanese Navy issued the requirements that would define the G4M's entire existence. A top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, a cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, a range of 4,722 kilometers unloaded, or 3,700 kilometers, while carrying an 800-kilogram bomb or torpedo payload. These requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's empire stretched across enormous distances of the Pacific. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. The Navy needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the reach of carrier-based aircraft, bombers that could operate from land bases and support naval operations across the entire theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short of these demands. The G4M Nell bomber, then in service, had a maximum range of roughly 3,000 kilometers. American bombers, such as the early B-17 variants, had even more limited range. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners were envisioning. The Navy's requirements were not arbitrary. They were calculated from the actual distances Japan would need to cover in a future Pacific War. From Formosa to the Philippines, about 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal, roughly 600 miles. From the Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. A bomber that could meet these requirements would give Japan a strategic reach that no other nation possessed. But the requirements were also based on assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners believed surprise and initiative would protect long-range bombers. They assumed enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They believed the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial power could be fully mobilized. Every one of those assumptions would collapse. The man tasked with achieving what seemed impossible was Kiro Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team after taking over from Joji Hattori. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany in the early 1930s, absorbing European engineering principles and manufacturing methods before returning to Japan. He immediately understood that meeting the Navy's demands would require compromises that Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled a team of engineers at Mitsubishi's facilities in Nagoya to confront the challenge. They analyzed every aspect of bomber design, assigning strict weight budgets to every component and system. They studied bombers from multiple nations, identify where weight could be reduced without sacrificing structural integrity. They experimented with new construction techniques and materials in search of further savings. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed enormous fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed about 0.8 kilograms. A load of 4,780 liters meant roughly 3,800 kilograms of fuel at full capacity. To achieve the necessary speed with that fuel load, the aircraft had to be extremely light. Every kilogram added to the empty weight reduced either range or payload. These two requirements were in direct conflict. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating strong enough to protect the crew and vital systems would add hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks added even more weight through rubber compounds and additional structural reinforcement. Fire suppression systems added further mass. Redundant safety measures added more still. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would make the Navy's performance requirements impossible to achieve. Honjo made a decision that would define the G4M throughout its entire service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum structures. There would be no self-sealing compounds, no armor plating around the fuel cells, no fire suppression systems beyond basic handheld extinguishers, no redundant safety measures. Every kilogram saved will be invested in fuel capacity, range, and meeting the Navy's demanded performance. This decision was not made lightly. Honjo fully understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities created by unprotected fuel tanks. They knew that combat damage to the wings would likely be catastrophic, but they also knew that with the technology available, the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance demands with known deadly weaknesses, or an aircraft that offered better protection but failed its mission before it ever flew. The Navy demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype took to the air on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy had set. Its speed exceeded expectations. Its range went beyond all projections. Its payload capacity satisfied operational demands. The bomber entered production as a Navy Type 1 attack bomber, with Mitsubishi manufacturing the aircraft at its factories in Nagoya. The first production versions, designated the G4M Model 1, began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December that year, approximately 180 G4M bombers were already in service with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would form the backbone of Japan's land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against 4C demonstrated, under the specific conditions of early 1942, the apparent wisdom of Honjo's design priorities. When facing limited opposition, when achieving tactical surprise, and when operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. Its range allowed it to strike from bases the enemy believed were safely out of reach. Its speed enabled rapid penetration into target areas. Its payload delivered serious, meaningful destruction. But all of these advantages rested on a single fragile assumption, that Betty formations would encounter minimal resistance. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became unavoidable, every design choice that favored range over protection became a death sentence for the crews. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed a fatal flaw in the Betty's design philosophy. From August through October 1942, more than 100 G4M bombers were lost along with their crews in what became a prolonged bloodletting that Japanese air forces could not sustain. The single mission on August 8th alone destroyed 18 of 23 aircraft, killing approximately 120 aviators. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Betty formations departed from Rabaul, flew the 600 miles of Guadalcanal, encountered American fighters, and suffered catastrophic losses. August 9th brought additional aircraft destroyed. August 10th brought more. By the end of August, The 4th Air Group had effectively ceased to exist as a functional combat unit. September brought no respite. Betty formations continued attacking American positions on Guadalcanal, and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. The mathematics were inexorable. Japanese forces had to strike American positions in order to contest control of the island. The Betty bombers were the only aircraft capable of delivering meaningful strike power from Rabaul, but every mission produced losses that could not be replaced. October saw the same deadly pattern continue. American fighter strength grew as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot quality improved as combat experience accumulated. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit the Betty's weaknesses even more efficiently. Japanese losses accelerated even as the number of available bombers steadily declined. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with the Japanese withdrawal, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men killed. The exchange rate was hopelessly unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities, transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots bluntly described as easy meat. Japanese planners had expected losses. Every military operation carried casualties. But the scale of the Betty's destruction exceeded all projections. The unprotected fuel tanks that enabled a 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any hit to the wings or fuselage would almost certainly be fatal. There was no middle ground. There were no damaged aircraft limping home. There were no wounded bombers that could be repaired and returned to service. Betty bombers either came back untouched or they exploded in flames. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers finally accepted that modifications were unavoidable. Beginning with the 663rd aircraft produced in March 1943, 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath the wing surfaces where the fuel tanks were located. These were not true self-sealing tanks. They were a compromise, designed to add as little weight as possible while offering minimal protection against fuel leakage. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour. Maximum range fell by 315 kilometers. Yet crew survival rates showed no meaningful improvement. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber bullet holes, but they could not prevent fires from larger rounds or cannon shells. They could not stop explosions when tracer rounds ignited fuel vapors. The fundamental vulnerability remained. Japanese designers attempted a more comprehensive solution with the G4M Model 3, introduced in October 1944. This version finally featured true self-sealing fuel tanks. Fuel capacity was reduced to 4,490 liters to accommodate the sealing materials. The change reduced maximum range to just 3,640 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original G4M Model 1. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced before the war ended. The modification came too late, and in numbers far too small to influence the Betty's combat record. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no amount of fuel tank protection would have allowed Betty bombers to operate effectively. The outcome of the war had already been decided. The Betty's vulnerability became so infamous that American forces began using the aircraft in operations that deliberately exploited its weaknesses. On April 18, 1943, the Betty bomb became the instrument of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's death, in an engagement that demonstrated both the power of American signals intelligence and the fatal design flaws of the aircraft itself. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese communications, revealing that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The Admiral would travel aboard a G4M bomber, escorted by fighters. 18P, 38 Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight, although only 16 ultimately took part after one aircraft blew a tire during takeoff and another suffered drop tank failures. The mission demanded extraordinary precision. The P-38s would have to fly more than 400 miles at wave top height, to avoid radar detection, navigate across open ocean without landmarks, and arrive at exactly the calculated intercept point at precisely the calculated time. Any navigation error, any deviation in timing would cause the mission to fail. The interception had to occur within a narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft would be fully exposed and unable to escape. The P-38s departed Guadalcanal at 7:25 hours. They flew at only 50 feet above the ocean for more than 400 miles, maintaining strict radio silence. Navigation depended entirely on dead reckoning and precise timekeeping. When the formation reached the intercept point, their accuracy would become legendary in aviation history. At 9:34 hours, exactly on schedule and only 1 minute ahead of predicted time, the P-38 pilots sighted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers were flying at low altitude, escorted by 6-0 fighters. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation to attack the bombers, while the remaining P-38s engaged the escorting fighters. Barber closed in on the lead Betty, the aircraft carrying Admiral Yamamoto. He fired into the wing area, where the unprotected fuel tanks were located. The result was immediate and catastrophic. The bomber erupted into flames and plunged into the jungle below. Yamamoto's body was later recovered, and the following day it was confirmed that he had died from injuries sustained in the crash. The second Betty bomber was also shot down and crashed, killing everyone aboard. The operation demonstrated several dimensions of Allied superiority at once. American signals intelligence had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications. American planners had calculated the intercept timing with 1-minute precision over more than 400 miles of open ocean. American fighter pilots had executed the mission flawlessly despite extraordinary navigational challenges. And the Betty's inherent vulnerability ensured that once interception occurred, survival was impossible. There was no chance for Yamamoto's aircraft to escape. The unprotected fuel tanks meant that any successful attack would be fatal. The Betty's vulnerability reached its most dramatic expression on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Oka rocket bomb beneath its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted, rocket-powered aircraft armed with a 1,200-kilogram warhead, designed specifically for kamikaze attacks against American warships. The mission required the Betty bombers to fly to within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oka aircraft. Once released, the Oka pilot would ignite the rocket motor and dive at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour toward American ships. The warhead carried enough explosive power to destroy any vessel it struck. But the entire plan depended on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to reach launch range. The formation departed Kanoya at approximately 14:30 hours. The 18 G4MS flew in tight formation with fighter escort toward American naval forces operating off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka beneath its fuselage, adding enormous weight and drag that drastically reduced speed and maneuverability. The aircraft were even more vulnerable than usual, unable to evade or maneuver effectively with the heavy external loads attached. American radar detected the formation at a distance of about 100 miles. F-6F Hellcat fighters from the USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. They reached the Japanese formation well before it approached release range. In the battle that followed, American fighters systematically annihilated the entire group. The Betty bombers, already fragile under normal combat conditions, were completely helpless while carrying the Oka weapons. The added weight prevented evasive action. The external payload increased drag and reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the sea. Not a single Betty survived long enough to release its Oka. Not a single Oka was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crewmen and 15 Oka pilots died in the attack. The mission became the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons across immense distances could not survive long enough to use those weapons when facing prepared opposition. Its extraordinary range meant nothing if it was destroyed before reaching its target. The final mission flown by Betty bombers came on August 19, 1945, for days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Two white-painted G4M aircraft marked with green crosses departed from Atsugi Airfield, carrying Japanese representatives to negotiate surrender terms with the Allied forces. They were given the call signs Bataan 1 and Bataan 2. The aircraft flew to IE Shima, where the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 transport for journey to Manila. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. The white paint and green crosses signified peaceful intent, transforming the bombers from weapons of war into instruments of diplomacy. The call signs reference Bataan, the site where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most devastating defeats in U.S. military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those same call signs carried Japan's own surrender delegation. Lieutenant Den Sudo piloted one of the surrender aircraft, a G4M Model 1 transport variant converted from the Betty bomber airframe. These transport versions retained a distinctive cylindrical fuselage and wing design, but carried passengers and cargo instead of bombs. The crew wore dress uniforms rather than flight suits. The aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, and no military equipment beyond what was required for flight. The journey from Atsugi to IE Shima covered roughly 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's operational range, even in transport configuration. American fighters escorted the White Betty bombers throughout the flight, ensuring they remained on the prescribed course. The escort served both as protection and supervision, guaranteeing safe passage while preventing any deviation. The White Betty bombers marked with green crosses became the final image of the aircraft that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941. The circle was complete. The bomber that had destroyed American air power in the Philippines in the first hours of the war now carried Japan's surrender delegation in its final days. The aircraft that had symbolized the reach of Japanese air power and effectiveness now came to symbolize Japan's defeat and submission to Allied terms. The production statistics of the Betty reflect both its central importance to Japanese operations and the terrible cost of the design philosophy behind it. Total production reached approximately 2,414 aircraft across all variants, although some sources cite figures as high as 2,435 when prototypes and minor subtypes are included. The differences in totals come from varying methods accounting experimental models, transport conversions, and small production runs. The G4M Model 1 accounted for roughly 1,172 aircraft built from 1941 through early 1943. This version featured the original unprotected fuel tank design with a total capacity of 4,780 liters. Its top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour. Its maximum range of 6,034 kilometers made it the longest-range bomber in operational service anywhere in the world. But the complete absence of protection systems made it catastrophically vulnerable once American fighter opposition intensified. The G4M Model 2, with increased fuel capacity and slightly higher speed, accounted for about 1,142 aircraft produced between 1943 and 1945. This version increased fuel capacity to 6,490 liters, extending its maximum range even further. Top speed rose slightly to 437 kilometers per hour, but the Model 2 retained the same fundamental weakness: unprotected fuel tanks. The modifications improved performance while leaving survivability unchanged. The G4M Model 3, also designated Model 34, represented the only version equipped with true self-sealing fuel tanks. Production began in October 1944, but only between 60 and 91 aircraft were completed before the end of the war, depending on the source. The self-sealing system reduced fuel capacity to 4,490 liters to make room for the sealing material. Maximum range dropped to 3,640 kilometers, a reduction of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original Model 1. The modification came far too late, and in numbers far too small to influence combat outcomes. The G4M transport variant, converted from bomber airframes, added approximately 30 aircraft. These transports carried passengers and cargo instead of weapons and served in liaison and communications roles. The G4M Model 1, used as one of the surrender aircraft in August 1945, belonged to this category. Production continued through August 1945, with final aircraft completed just days before Japan's surrender. Mitsubishi factories produced Betty bombers at peak rates of roughly 100 aircraft per month during 1943. Output declined in 1944 and 1945 as Allied bombing disrupted Japanese industry, and as resources were diverted to fighter production for homeland defense. These production numbers made the Betty one of the most numerous bombers Japan ever built, surpassed only by certain fighter types. Over 4 years of war, Mitsubishi delivered about 2,400 aircraft to Japanese Navy units across the Pacific Theater. The bombers served in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, and struck targets across distances measured in thousands of kilometers. But production figures tell only half the story. Loss rates tell the rest. Few Betty bombers survived until the end of the war. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires of the unprotected fuel tanks made almost inevitable. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Betty bombers remained. The aircraft that had once numbered in the hundreds in 1942 had been reduced to mere dozens by attrition that no production effort could replace. Casualty statistics among Betty crews were equally devastating. Although precise numbers remain difficult to verify, what is certain is that thousands of Japanese aircrew died aboard Betty bombers, their deaths made nearly unavoidable by the aircraft's fundamental vulnerabilities. The unprotected fuel tanks created a situation where survival depended entirely on avoiding any combat damage. Once hit, a Betty rarely survived. Once on fire, it never survived. The crews understood these odds and flew anyway. Military discipline and cultural values demanded acceptance of risk regardless of the consequences. Surviving Betty crew members were nearly unanimous in their assessment. The aircraft's unprotected fuel tanks made survival a matter of pure chance. No level of skill, no tactical innovation, and no amount of courage could overcome the vulnerability built into every G4M. Former Flight Petty Officer Masuato, who completed 28 combat missions before being transferred to training duties, offered perhaps the most direct summary. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The contrast with Allied bomber protection systems highlights the stark difference in design philosophy. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating protecting the pilot and co-pilot seats, with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.31 inches thick. Armored bulkheads shielded crew positions throughout the fuselage. The bombardier's position was protected by armored glass. Waist gunners had protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the B-17C model onward. Introduced in 1941, the B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection. The pilot and co-pilot seats were backed by armor. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production runs. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 9,100 kilograms reflected the heavy price of this protection, roughly 2,000 kilograms more than the Betty despite a similar size and operational role. For the Allies, this weight penalty was accepted as necessary and non-negotiable. American wartime studies demonstrated the effectiveness of crew protection with statistical precision. Body armor reduced fatalities from thoracic wounds from 36% to just 8%, a reduction of more than 75%. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected aircraft when damaged in combat. Protected crew positions increased survival by shielding airmen from shell fragments and small arms fire. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties during head-on attacks. Armored bulkheads compartmentalized the fuselage, stopping fire or structural damage in one section from spreading throughout the aircraft. This comprehensive approach to crew protection reflected American doctrine, which held that trained air crews were more valuable than the aircraft themselves. Planes could be replaced. Experienced combat veterans could not. The weight cost of this protection exceeded 1,000 kilograms in most American bombers, but the vast industrial capacity of the United States allowed this penalty without sacrificing production. American factories produced more than 12,000 B-17 Flying Fortresses and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. That production strength meant American forces could field huge numbers of heavily protected bombers while maintaining overwhelming operational capability. Japanese doctrine reached a very different conclusion. The Betty's design reflected a belief that range and striking power were more important than crew survival. It assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection. It assumed enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed the war would be short and decisive. Every one of these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. By mid-1942, American fighter strength had grown to the point where interception of Betty formations became routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every weakness in the aircraft. By 1943, Betty missions resulted in such devastating losses that many operations became virtual suicide attacks. By 1944, Betty bombers could scarcely operate in daylight against American opposition at all. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage that made the aircraft terrifying in early 1942 became meaningless once sustained combat began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching their targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases. Payload meant nothing when entire formations were destroyed before weapon release. The examination of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the complete truth. The unprotected fuel tanks that stunned Major McCoy were not an oversight. They were not a temporary shortcut. They were not a design failure. They were a deliberate decision. Engineers had consciously chosen range over survival. Japanese designers built exactly what their specifications demanded. An aircraft of extraordinary range and speed, built with minimal weight, optimized for mission performance rather than crew protection. The fuel tanks were unprotected because protection would have prevented achieving the required performance. Within the limits of 1937 technology and 1937 assumptions about warfare, the decision made sense. But those assumptions collapsed when confronted by a prolonged conflict against an opponent with enormous industrial capacity and rapidly advancing technology. The Betty bomber became a symbol of Japan's willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in pursuit of tactical advantage. It became proof of a military culture that valued mission accomplishment over crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they were not merely analyzing a captured aircraft. They were seeing the physical embodiment of decisions made years earlier. Decisions that prioritized capability over survival. Decisions that would ultimately cost thousands of Japanese aircrew their lives. The unprotected fuel tanks were not an accident. They were a choice. The Betty bomber served from the first day of the Pacific War to the last. It sank capital ships. It devastated air bases. It crossed distances no other bomber could match. But its legacy is written not in victories, but in lost statistics that exceeded every projection. The aircraft that opened the war by destroying American air power at Clark Field ended the war carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted aircraft marked with green crosses. The crew of tail number 763-12 had abandoned their bomber during the American advance on Clark Field. They survived by walking away from an aircraft whose design made survival in combat nearly impossible. Most Betty crews were not so fortunate. They flew knowing the risks. They climbed into unprotected bombers. They crossed vast Pacific distances. and they died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires that the aircraft design made inevitable. The story of the Betty bomber is ultimately the story of the price of capability without protection. It demonstrates that performance alone cannot guarantee success when that performance is purchased at the cost of crew survival. A range of 6,000 kilometers meant nothing when aircraft could not survive the final 100 kilometers to the target. A speed of 428 kilometers per hour meant nothing when American fighters could intercept with radar warning and superior numbers. A payload of 1 ton meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapon release. More importantly, the Betty reveals what happens when military technology is divorced from realistic assessments of combat conditions. Weapons built without regard for survivability end up killing their own crews almost as efficiently as they destroy enemy targets. The assumptions behind the Betty's design, assumptions of limited opposition and short war duration, were proven false within months of the Pacific War's beginning. By the time this became undeniable, thousands of Betty bombers were already in service or under construction, and Japanese industry lacked the capacity to replace them with safer designs. Japanese engineers understood the risks in 1937 and 1938. They calculated the weight penalties. They knew the vulnerabilities. They accepted the trade-offs because they believed performance would decide the war. They were wrong, and thousands of men paid for that mistake with their lives. The Betty's legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions of military ethics, design philosophy, acceptable risk, and the value of human life in warfare. American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection, even at the cost of performance. Japanese designers answered them differently. The burning Betty bombers across the Pacific sky became the visible consequence of that philosophical divide. One nation designed aircraft to bring crews home. The other designed aircraft to reach targets regardless of cost. In the end, the nation that valued crew survival built an air force capable of sustaining operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic losses for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 763 to 12 at Clark Field provided final confirmation of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber was not poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve its assigned goals. Those goals simply did not include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single truth lies the entire reason Japan lost the air war in the Pacific.